information. Red flag warning remains in effect until 7 p.m. this evening for wind and low relative humidity. A red flag warning means that critical fire weather conditions are either occurring now or will shortly. Any fires that ignite may spread rapidly and exhibit extreme fire behavior. Use extreme caution if engaging in any activities that could start a fire. A red flag warning means that critical fire weather conditions are either occurring now or will shortly.
Well, good morning. Good to see everyone today. Back in the 1990s, way back in the day, probably, my guess is this is probably 93 when this happened. I was serving as a youth minister in Abilene, Texas, and we had a family in our church that they lived 3 or 4 doors south of the church, and the houses in this little neighborhood that the church was located in, I would put in the category of the post-World War II tract houses that were like really small. In fact, the house we lived in was probably maybe 800 square foot, 2 bedrooms. And so this family came to church. They had about 4 or 5 kids in that tiny little 2-bedroom house that they had. But they did have a garage apartment that was, separated between, the house and the back. The backyard separated the house and the garage. So they had a 14-year-old son. So to make room for the other kids in the house, they decided to allow that son to live in the garage apartment. That's a red flag warning. I'm just going to go ahead and lay that out. In fact, we had a youth group trip. And in fact, the youth group went over to DFW, went to a Rangers game. They had like a faith night or something like that. Tara and I were actually already in the Metroplex when this was happening, so we met our youth group there. And as the youth group was walking in, one of our youth group sponsors made a statement about, "That's a nice car." And the kid was Matthew. Matthew was his name. Matthew said, "You want it?" And she's like, "No, I'm good, thanks." He goes, "I'll steal it for you." And so I remember Sharon coming to me and saying, "I think he was serious. I think he was willing to steal the car for me." Now, fast forward a couple of months, Dad comes into my office and says, "Hey, would you be willing to talk to Matthew? We're having a lot of trouble." You see, he was into gangs, and he was into drugs, and he was into crime at a very, very young age. And I'm thinking, garage apartment. This is probably not working out real well for you. So anyway, I had a meeting with Matthew, and I was in my young life, but even looking back, I don't know that I've ever dealt with somebody so cold. And eventually asking the question, do you not really care what you're doing to your family? And I try, because it's been like 30 years, but I think what he said, something along the lines of, "I don't care. And I don't care that I don't care." It's kind of one of those chilling sort of moments. In fact, it's like, I think about that, and I think about this kid at a very young age who was so very closed off. I think about what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 24. In fact, in Matthew chapter 24, he's talking about end times and what it will be like. He said, "Sin will be rampant everywhere, and the love of many will grow cold." Now, I don't think that when we look at our lives and so on, that we're ever going to be like that kid Matthew who is completely cold, completely shut off. But let me ask this question. What do you do when you feel like your love is growing cold? What do you do when you feel like your heart is beginning to harden? And not that your heart is beginning to harden, but your heart is beginning to harden toward God. And you probably say, that's a place I don't want to go. But I think if we're all honest, we've experienced that at some point in time. So what we're going to do as we talk about red flag series, red flag warnings, what we're doing in this series is we're looking at some of the passages of the Bible that really should serve as warnings to us. And the warning that we're looking at today it's really a big narrative of Scripture. It takes place over several chapters. It's the narrative of a man called Moses, but also part of that was Pharaoh and the 10 plagues that we find that kind of preceded the Israelites going out of Egypt. But what we find is a man who has a hardened heart. So let's go ahead and set the stage. God's people, they ended up in Egypt, and they began to grow, and they became enslaved. And God actually heard the cry of his people. Moses, who was an Israelite, committed murder, ended up fleeing to Midian. He is out taking care of sheep, and all of a sudden one day he sees this fire, and there's a bush that is burning, but it is not burning up, and God is in the fire. He tells Moses, you're going to go back to Egypt, and you're going to help bring my people out of Egypt and into the promised land. So Moses, not really hip on the idea, but eventually agrees. He and his brother Aaron go and they make the initial request of Pharaoh of, listen, we're going to draw our people out. And Pharaoh, well, we've kind of begin to see that he already had a hardened heart toward God. Let's look at Exodus chapter 5 and verses 6 through 9. It says, that same day Pharaoh sent this order to the Egyptian slave drivers and the Israelite foremen. Do not supply any more straw for making bricks. Make the people get it themselves. But still require them to make the same number of bricks as before. Don't reduce the quota. They are lazy. That's why they are crying out, let us go and offer sacrifices to our God. Load them down with more work, make them sweat. That will teach them to listen to the lies. So basically what we find is a man who already has a hardened heart. And again, as Moses and Aaron, they come to Pharaoh, and they're again making their request to let the people go out into the wilderness to worship. And we find this in Exodus chapter 7, verses 10 through 13. So Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and did what the Lord commanded them. Aaron threw down the staff before Pharaoh and his officials, and it became a serpent. Then Pharaoh called in his own wise men and sorcerers, and these Egyptian magicians did the same thing with their magic. They threw down their staffs, which also became serpents, but then Aaron's staff swallowed up their staffs. Now, this, again, even at the outset of the story, God is proving himself greater than. And so even those things that we call great in our culture, God will always be greater than them. And it also goes on to say, Pharaoh's heart, however, remained hard, and he refused to listen just as the Lord predicted. And as we go through this narrative, we go through the story, I think it's going to be important for us to see a couple of very important items here. First of all, Pharaoh hardened his heart, and he refused to listen. A heart that is hardened toward God will refuse to listen to him. And so God, Pharaoh is not budging, so he's like, okay, we're going to go there. And he begins to perform plagues all throughout Egypt. And there's actually 10 of them. And it's interesting to see what happens as these plagues kind of proceed. The first few plagues, I'm going to say, are more nuisance plagues. They're kind of like bothersome sort of things. But they progressively get worse. And so the very first one is Moses, through the power of God, turns the Nile River into blood. Of course, then they have their magicians come in, and they do the exact same thing. But it says here in chapter 7, verse 22, but again the magicians of Egypt used their magic, and they turned water into blood. So Pharaoh's heart remained hard, and he refused to listen to Moses and Aaron, just as the Lord predicted. So because he refused to listen, God said, okay, now it's round 2. Round 2, we're going to go into this plague. And so we find chapter 8, verse 15. It says, "But when Pharaoh saw the relief from the frogs," right, and he had requested relief, he became stubborn. He refused to listen to Moses and Aaron, just as the Lord predicted. So occasionally it will say, as we go through here, that his heart was hardened. Other times it will say he is stubborn. And I think we have to understand that he became stubborn is equivalent to a hardened heart. And at this hardened heart, God says, okay, round 3. Round 3, he sends gnats. Now, I just happen to think that of all the plagues, maybe this one, I mean, it's bothersome, but you maybe can live through this. But one of the things that happens is that, like his magicians and his advisors come to him and say, dude, something big's going on here. Something's going on. In fact, notice what happens in Exodus chapter 8, verse 19. It says, "This is the finger of God," the magicians exclaimed to Pharaoh. But Pharaoh's heart remained hard. He wouldn't listen to them, just as the Lord predicted. And so we begin to see that sometimes obstinate hearts come into play, and we're not even going to willing to listen to people around us about some of the warnings that they are giving. Like, this is the finger of God. This is the hand of God. You got to understand that there's something big going on, but he refused to listen. So God says, okay, round 4. Round 4 is coming about, and round 4 is a plague of flies. But this plague is different in that God puts a clear line of delineation here that the flies go to people that are Egyptian, and there are no flies that go to the Israelites. And again, Pharaoh is like, Moses, please ask your God for it to go away. And he does so. And it says here in chapter 8, verses 30 through 32, "So Moses left Pharaoh's palace and pleaded with the Lord to remove all the flies. And the Lord did as Moses asked and caused the swarm of flies to disappear from Pharaoh, his officials, and his people. Not a single fly remained." That's, again, a miraculous act of God. But Pharaoh again became stubborn and refused to let the people go. He was kind of beginning to think, maybe I'll let people go, and then he pulled the rug out from underneath them. And so God says, okay, round 5. Round 5, again, there's that clear line of delineation, and it's a plague of livestock. And it's not just some of the livestock, it is all of the livestock that belong to the Egyptians die. Cattle, horses, donkeys, mules, you name it. Anything in the category of livestock goes away. But yet the Israelites, all of their cattle and livestock live. And the interesting thing is, God said this is what's going to happen, and he warned him about what was going to happen, and he hardened his heart anyway. But after it happened, again, he's asking for reprieve. But we find this in chapter 9, verses 6 and 7. It says, "And the Lord did just as he had said. The next morning all the livestock of the Egyptians died, but the Israelites didn't lose a single animal. Pharaoh sent his officials to investigate, and they discovered that the Israelites had not lost a single animal. But even so, Pharaoh's heart remained stubborn, and he still refused to let people go. His heart remained stubborn. His heart remained hard. And I think, we're thinking, how could Pharaoh go through all of that and be so stubborn? How could he go through all of that and still have a hardened heart? And I have to ask the question, how can we go through all that we go through and still be obstinate before God? Still have a stubborn heart and a hardened heart. And it almost kind of feels like Pharaoh is digging in his heels. Again, so we get to round 6, plague number 6. And what we find is God says, here's what I need you to do, Moses. I need you to take some ash from a kiln. So I'm just going to say it like this: ash from a fireplace. I want you to throw it up in the air, and it's going to spread all throughout Egypt. And as it spreads throughout Egypt, it's going to the picture in my mind, because we live here in New Mexico, is we understand that haze and that eerie feeling of smoke filling the air. It's happening in the Northeast United States, and nothing against what's happening there. I feel for them, but I did say this week, we go through this all the time, and the national news doesn't really care. But it happens back there, and everybody's like, it's the end of the world. Like, they're so soft. Now, please understand, yeah, we deal with this on the yearly most of the time. But the reality is, it's an eerie sort of thing. But when that ash touched their skin, boils, oozy, pussy boils all over their body. But again, we find this, and things are changing now. Let's look at verse 12 of chapter 9. But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. And just as the Lord predicted, Pharaoh refused to listen. Does anybody get uncomfortable when you read the words that God hardened Pharaoh's heart? I look at that and go, whoa. But I also have to understand that when we become obstinate and we continue to harden our hearts before God, there might come a time where God says, okay, I'm going to keep your hard heart, your heart hard, but I'm going to use it for my glory and my purpose and my honor now. I'm going to be able to work through that. And listen, world history is full of people where God has worked through the hardened hearts of people. And He has come to bring about His glory and His purpose through that. And so we also now get to plague number 7, because Pharaoh wouldn't budge. This is a plague of hail. And we are actually in the office talking about, weather sort of warnings the other day, and talking about the different things that will bring those red flag warnings in different areas of the country. And Candace talked about the fact that she grew up a lot of her life, spent a lot of her life in California, and there are earthquakes, and those are difficult to go through. And here in the Southwest United States, we deal with fire. And I grew up in Middle America, and we dealt with Tornado Alley sort of stuff. And then I was thinking about that, and I was saying, tornadoes don't really scare me, because they're usually pretty small and isolated, and most of the time they're out in the prairie, and they're not going to do a lot of damage. But what really scares me are hailstorms, because they can do a ton of damage. I went through a hailstorm when I was a little kid. Maybe it's traumatic, but I remember when we lived in West Texas, there's a little town called Coleman, and they actually had a hailstorm when we lived there, where they had softball and small cantaloupe size hail. People died. And so in my mind, this is what I'm thinking is happening in Egypt. And so God sends hail, and it says in verse 27 of chapter 9, then Pharaoh quickly summoned Moses and Aaron. This time I have sinned, he confessed. The Lord is the righteous one, and my people and I are wrong. So maybe now, maybe he's getting it, right? So this is what happens, though. So Moses left Pharaoh's court and went out of the city. When he lifted his hands to the Lord, the thunder and hail stopped, and the downpour ceased. It's like God shut off the faucet. But when Pharaoh saw that the rain, hail, and thunder had stopped, he and his officials sinned again, and Pharaoh again became stubborn. You ever wondering, when's this dude actually going to get it? So God sends another plague. The next plague is darkness. Now, interestingly, there have been some theologians that have mentioned that all of the plagues, all of the 10 plagues, are addressing that God is greater than all the gods in Egypt. Or specifically, there's this God here, this God here, this God here. Now, in a study of that, my personal study of that, I think it's hard to connect all the dots to a specific God. But in the Egyptian culture, there were two primary gods. There were two gods that were greater than all the other gods. One was Pharaoh. We'll get to that one here in a moment. But the other was the sun god Ra. And so Pharaoh was most sovereign. He was the highest god. But then the sun god, they worshiped the sun. They worshiped the fertility that the sun would bring. And so God sends darkness. He sends darkness over the land. But it's interesting here when we see what happens with the darkness. Let me get to it. Finally, Pharaoh called for Moses. He said, "Go and worship the Lord, but leave your flocks and herds here. You may even take your little ones with you." But then it goes on to say, "But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart once more. It would not let them go." "Get out of here," Pharaoh shouted at Moses. "I am warning you. Never come back to see me again. The day you see my face, you will die." You see, there's a couple of lessons I think we can get here. We can go back to the plague of locusts and understand a couple of things. Number one, hardened hearts want to stay hard. Have you ever noticed that with people? Have you ever noticed that sometimes hardened hearts just want to stay hard? And when they begin to kind of bend and mold just a little bit, they stiffen up. Have you ever been around somebody who says, "I just want to be mad"? What do you want to be mad about? I don't know. I just want to be mad. And so Pharaoh here is like, he's got a hardened heart, and it just kind of sticks this way. Also, I think one of the things that we have to understand is like the number of times that we kind of skipped over the plague of locusts, but the plague of locusts that happened is, he was like, "Sure, go ahead and go, but don't let the women go. Don't let the children go." And then it was, "Go ahead and go, but don't take the livestock." It's interesting that I think hardened hearts are never going to be truly, fully open to the will of God. Like God says, "This is what I want to happen." And it's like, fine, I'll let this happen, but I want to control the narrative. Fine, I'll let this happen, but I want it to happen this way. And so one of the things that I think we find happening here is Pharaoh's bargaining with God. Let me ask you, do you ever bargain with God? Have you ever said, "Okay, God, if you get me out of this, I will never this again"? Or if you answer this prayer, "I promise I'll read the Bible every day. I promise I'll go to church every Sunday." You put out that bargaining chip and the bargaining tool before God. And I think, again, that's a sign that our hearts are not fully open to the will of God. So after 9 plagues, God says, "Okay, it's time. It's time to prove that I'm really God. And it's time to let people know that my will cannot be thwarted." Listen, that's one of the things. I know that might sound harsh, but God is going to accomplish His plan, whether we're in it or not. And Pharaoh had been obstinate, and he had hardened his heart time and time and time again. So God says, "Okay, here's what's going to happen." And the Israelites were told that a death angel is going to come and is going to pass through every house in Egypt. But if the death angel sees the blood on the doorposts from the Passover lamb, well then he will pass over that house. But every other home, firstborn child, even the firstborn male of livestock, would die. And if you've seen the movie The Ten Commandments, right? You have that picture of Moses or of Pharaoh and his child who is gone. And God proved that he was, in fact, God. But I want you to understand something about his hardened heart and what hardened hearts do today. Hardened hearts create a trail of collateral damage. You see, Pharaoh's hardened heart destroyed a country. Pharaoh's hardened heart destroyed the economic structure of a country. Pharaoh's hardened heart led to the death of people. Now you're thinking, well, that's him, right? But I'm just going to say, you don't have to be a world leader to have a hardened heart. And you don't have to be a world leader to create a collateral damage, a trail of collateral damage as a result of your hardened heart. And I think the red flag warning is, without even knowing it, our hearts can harden toward God. And our hearts can harden toward God because life. Our hearts can harden toward God because of life circumstances. In fact, we can look at the fact that sometimes there's death and there's illness and there's failed relationships, and there's business failure, and there's hopes and dreams of life didn't work out like we expected. And there's hardened hearts that can happen just because we squeeze Jesus out of our daily schedules. And we're sometimes surrounded by difficult people, and difficult people cause us to build up walls. And when we build up walls, that creates a hardened heart. And I believe that Satan will do everything that he can to use circumstances in our lives to harden our hearts. In fact, if you go back to the very, very first sin in the Garden of Eden, it's interesting, Satan didn't question the existence of God. He didn't even question the authority of God. But he did cause Adam and Eve to question the goodness of God. And Satan wants you to question the goodness of God. Ever done that? Have you ever asked the question, why would God? Or why did God? Or why would God allow? And Satan knows that when we question the goodness of God, that is like the express lane to a hardened heart. But I want to let you know that a hardened heart doesn't have to stay that way. In fact, if you fast forward several hundred years, the Israelites, after they had gone into the promised land, you know what? Their hearts were still hardened. As much as Pharaoh's heart was hardened, their hearts were hardened, and they were disobedient, and they weren't open to the will of God, and their hearts were closed to God. And one of the things that we find is God was getting ready to take them into captivity, but in taking them into captivity, God said, but I want to give you some hope. I want to give you some hope of what will happen one day. And in Ezekiel chapter 11, verse 19, it says, and I will give them singleness of heart and put a new spirit within them. I will take away their stony, stubborn heart and give them a tender, responsive heart. And some of your versions of Scripture might actually say, and you may have heard this before, I will turn a heart of stone into a heart of flesh. And we're thinking, How does that happen? And I'm going to say it like this, and this is our bottom line here today. Through Jesus, God wants to turn a heart of stone into a heart of flesh. The only one who can change our hearts is not us, it is Jesus. And he can take a stubborn stone heart and turn it into a heart of flesh. In fact, if I were to give you the theme of the Bible, if I were going to give you like the story of the Bible from beginning to end, it is God persistently and passionately pursuing people with stony hearts so that he could introduce them to Jesus and turn their hearts into a heart of flesh. That's the story of the Bible. But I've also learned this about me. Just me. Maybe you, but I know this for me. Sometimes God needs to break my heart in order to melt it. In order to change my heart, God needs to bring me to a place where he breaks it. And so with that in mind, I want to ask some questions. We said here today that, or last week, that we're going to meddle a little bit, that good preaching meddles into people's lives. And so I'm just going to ask a question, actually 3 questions here today. One is this: what are you bringing into your mind that is hardening your heart? Whether we know it or not, and we live in what's called the digital age or the age of information, we are inundated with messages all the time. We are inundated with messages so much that I don't know that we are able to adequately process all the messages that are coming in. Have you ever thought about that? Have you ever thought about, like, we have so much that's bombarding our minds all the time that it's absolutely stunning and amazing, but at the same time it's very frustrating. I mean, I think about when I was a kid. We didn't have a remote-controlled TV, right? I can remember the fact that I was the remote. Like my dad would like turn to channel 13. Like we only had a couple channels, and that was like kind of like the amount of information that's coming in. But now we live in a society and culture where we have streaming devices and we have streaming ability on our TVs and all of the different things that are available to us. And there's so many messages, and whether you know it or not, the internet is spying on you. There, said it. Did you hear that, Google? Right? I mean, the internet is like, have you ever had like that conversation and then a couple of like hours later you get on the computer and all of a sudden it's there? I don't know what to do with it, but we have so much coming in. We have so many messages coming in. We have so many news cycles going on all the time. And heck, one of the things that they've said about if you could time travel, that if we could go back in time, like 500-600 years, the thing that would like startle us the most is the odor, and it would not be good. But if people 500 years or 1,000 years ago could come back and travel ahead in time, and they would come into our world, you know what they would probably say is most jarring? The noise. And so with all the messages and all the content continually bombarding us, I'm just going to suggest that it's creating 2 very symbiotic problems in our society. And one is anxiety. You know, each Tuesday we get to pray over all of the prayer requests that we have as a church. And it is amazing to me the amount of anxiety that we are praying for on a consistent basis. And it's especially true within like our student culture, that kids are dealing with, you know, all the pressures of social media, and it's just creating anxiety, and along with anxiety becomes anger. Listen, I don't have any empirical data. I just have observation here. My observation is people are angrier today than they were 5 years ago, and 10 years ago, and 15 years ago. It just seems like people are like on the edge all the time. And so I think that these really are two things that are symbiotic in nature. And listen, there's a media machine in our world today. And there's a media machine that I don't know that they really have a goal to that's to inform us as much as it is to make us anxious and angry. And so with that, I have to understand, listen, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I am a conspiracy realist here. And I believe that there is an enemy, and there is an enemy who knows that anger and anxiety is the expressway to a hardened heart. And so I'm going to ask you, what are you bringing into your mind? What are you bringing in that is contributing to that? But then also, let me ask this question. Where is your heart hardened toward God? I'm not even going to ask if your heart is hardened toward God. Where is it hardened toward God? Maybe it's a bad church experience, a bad family experience. Maybe people have disappointed you. Maybe there's a trauma, a broken relationship. Maybe it's an illness. And all those things maybe together that really begin that process of you asking those hard questions, those big questions that really lead you to question the goodness of God. So identifying that, I think, is an important item. But finally, this is, what adjustments do you need to make in your life? What adjustments do you need to make in your life to bring your hardened heart before God, before Jesus, so He can do the work that He needs to do? He actually begins to do heart surgery in your life. Maybe things need to go away. Maybe people need to go away. Maybe boundaries need to be set. Maybe you need to unplug, change channels, power off. Maybe that's an adjustment. Maybe it's some things that need to be added to your life. Maybe a regular worship schedule. Maybe being part of a small group. Maybe regular study of the Bible. I think about my wife's grandmother. One of the things that they always said about her, she didn't go to bed at night until she's read her Bible. And then many times they would find her Bible on her bed, or maybe even on her, because she fell asleep reading the Bible. Maybe that's a routine that you need to develop in your life. And maybe just maybe, and I'm just going to throw this out, maybe you need to make a decision for the very first time in your life to allow Jesus to do heart surgery, to make some changes in your life. And that coincides with a decision for the very first time to say, I'm going to follow Jesus. If you want to know what that's going to look like in your life, we'd love to help you do that. I'm going to be standing in the back during our time of communion. Will you join me in prayer?